I am going to give the floor now to Patricia Castillo from Eurecat, who, as I've said before, has been the coordinator, or is the coordinator, in fact, of the DIAMOND project. Probably you already know this, but DIAMOND and TInnGO are sister projects. This means that they have been funded under the same call by the European Union through the Horizon 2020 program. So I am giving the floor to Patricia, who will chair this session on influencing policy. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fuentes. Good morning, everyone. I am beyond happy to be here with you today in this fifth session, Influencing Policy. As you know, this conference is all about creating a paradigm shift towards gender and equality in smart systems, in smart mobility. This fifth session is a fundamental piece of this process. Bluntly put, it is about getting things done. After all, a policy is a plan of action agreed by a group of people with the power to implement it and enforce it. Therefore, influencing policy, be it organizational or public policy, is instrumental to set the wheels in motion towards the change we want to create. Unfortunately, this is easier said than done. Let's be honest, the job of a policymaker is tough. There are lots of challenges and pressing issues to address. There's often little time, small budgets, and above all, minimal tolerance to failure. So how can we actually help policymakers to prioritize, implement, and to enforce the policies we need for this paradigm change? How do we funnel the knowledge generated by the experts into low-risk, high-impact policies? So in the coming hour, 5 experts will guide us through these questions and illuminate the path for influencing policy towards fair and inclusive transport and mobility systems. So I want to welcome Dr. Lena Levin from VTI, the Swedish National Road and Transport Research Institute, Dr. Augustus Ababio-Donkor from Edinburgh Napier University, Jackie Bridgman from the University of Northampton, Dr. Angela Carboni from Politecnico di Torino, and Dr. Yvonne Hill from University of Stirling. Dr. Yvonne Hill will open our discussion today. Yvonne is Research Fellow in the Management, Work and Organization Department in the School of Management at the University of Stirling. She has been working on the DIAMOND project around the concept of fairness in relation to women and women transport users. But 1 second before I give the floor to Yvonne, I just want to remind the audience that we will have some time for questions and answers towards the end of the session. You may submit your questions via the chat. Also, I remind all panelists that you have 10 minutes each for your presentation. Now, with that said, Yvonne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just have to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much. Today, so I am Dr. Yvonne Hale. I'm at Stirling University in the UK, and I am working as part of the DIAMOND project. And today I will be speaking to you about fairness. So in many countries, including the UK, fairness in transport has traditionally been based on principles of formal equity, with an emphasis on treating people equally in terms of no one suffering the costs or getting the benefits disproportionately, and ensuring at least minimal levels of transport provision for all. However, while justice and fairness have become increasingly important in sustainability and transport policy, the definition of fairness and how it should be incorporated into transport decision making and planning remains unclear. So today I will be discussing the DIAMOND project and how we look to develop a working definition of fairness in order to explore equality in access to and use of public transport, but also employment across the transport sector. So our project team are made up of 14 international and interdisciplinary partners. These cover transport organisers, academic institutions, management institutions, and we've all come together to focus on 4 real-world scenarios where inclusiveness and gender are currently issues. So our use case 1 looked at railways and public multimodal transport. Use case 2 looked at user experiences in autonomous vehicles. Use case 3 was vehicle sharing, namely bike sharing, and use case 4 was regarding fairness and inclusion for employment in the transport sector. Views on fairness in transport are closely associated with the concepts of equal opportunity, equality or equal outcomes, and social justice, with most of these terms being used interchangeably throughout any academic literature. In the main, the terms fairness, equality, and justice tend to be used to describe both how decisions are made and how various individuals are treated across a community and the outcomes of such decisions. Fairness can be a vague and ambiguous concept which evolves and changes over time and space. So the notion of fairness is closely related to concepts of justice, equity, and human rights, and centres on how people are treated or they perceive themselves to be treated, especially the requirement that they be treated alike in the absence of significant differences between groups. The terms fairness and justice both tend to be used to describe how decisions are made and how individuals are treated within a community in a way that is justifiable with regard to the role they fulfil. However, the many varieties of justice and fairness principles can make it difficult to separate these concepts at times. You know, as I said before, fairness is also linked to notions of equality, in particular equality of opportunities, so in which job applicants are treated similarly, for example, unhampered by artificial barriers or prejudice or preferences, except when particular distinctions can be explicitly justified, i.e. with disabled people. And equality of outcomes, people have approximately the same material wealth and income, or in which general economic conditions of their lives are alike. However, the concept of fairness is also influenced by its relationship with a variety of justice concepts, including distributive justice, which relates to how the benefits and costs and burdens of transport systems in this case are distributed equitably among and between individual groups and communities. Social justice is based on the concepts of human rights and equality and can be defined as the way in which human rights are manifested in the everyday lives of people at every level of society. Organisational and procedural justice, which reflects perceptions of the processes that led to these outcomes. Improving employee outcomes, providing organisational policies and regulations which deliver equality in relation to working conditions, salary, home-work balance, and the design of a work framework adopted to women. The varieties of justice and fairness principles can make it difficult to separate the concepts at times. Procedural fairness is concerned with the procedures used by decision makers rather than the actual outcomes reached. It requires a fair and proper procedure to be used when making decisions. A decision maker who follows a fair procedure is more likely to reach a fair and correct decision. Fairness in transport is by no means a new concept. Transport academics and others have been aware of and written about the impact of unfair transport practices on disadvantaged groups, particularly in relation to social and economic exclusion since around the 1960s. However, in more recent times, authors, particularly those who've focused on ethics and organisational behaviour, have looked to provide a clear definition between the two concepts, claiming that justice is about a common set of societal standards which all should be treated by, and fairness is an acknowledgement that these standards are appropriate, i.e. they're suited to the disabled, to specific ethnicities, genders, etc. From this perspective, processes of fairness are related to reactions and assessments of societal normative standards of justice. As I say, fairness is also related to concepts of equity and equality. Horizontal equity, that relates to the egalitarian concept of equal treatment of equals, and notions of fairness and egalitarianism with a focus on distributional justice in terms of individuals and groups of equal ability and need receiving similar benefits and costs. Vertical equity, on the other hand, is related to social justice. This is about the distribution of benefits and costs across different groups, whether that is through social class or gender or social inclusion. And this focuses on the differences in the ability or need between and within groups. So this is more about equity. This is about ensuring that transport policies should favour disadvantaged groups such as people with disabilities would be situated on the vertical axis. So as you see, the vertical and horizontal fit really nicely within the transport context. So some characteristics, for example, sex, child rearing responsibilities, especially but not solely when travelling with children, may mean that certain groups are less likely to have equal opportunities to access public transport. So embedding notions of equity, both vertical, how much transport access do women have compared to the rest of the population, and horizontal equity, do all groups of women have the same access? And transport planning and delivery should help to ensure that women with similar ability and need and those who are transport disadvantaged have equal access to suitable public transport systems. So how did we reach our definition of fairness? Well, this was actually a two-stage process for the DIAMOND project. The first stage involved conducting traditional literature reviews on fairness, and we did this across the 4 use cases. So therefore, in terms of women using public transport, of the use of EV vehicles, bike hire and employment. So each partner was given a use case and they conducted the literature review. When we then accessed the fairness characteristics that were most common for each of these use cases, we put this to focus groups, which we conducted, where the sample involved users of transport and people employed in the sector. It came along to TU Dublin, our Irish partners on the project, and we conducted face-to-face focus groups regarding what they thought of our fairness characteristics that were highlighted through the literature review. After this, we then conducted a scoping review to capture any additional relevant scientific literature on the focus from and the findings from the focus groups. Putting all of this together, we conducted interdisciplinary analysis, combining all the methods, and this is how we developed our working definition. So for the DIAMOND project, when we discuss fairness in relation to women employed or using transport, we say that fairness is a state in which people are treated similarly, unimpeded by prejudice or unnecessary distinctions or barriers, except when they can explicitly be justified. So how does this work operationally? So in use case 1, as you say, we looked at fairness for women as transport users. Fair and equal accessibility to public transport would include the availability of and physical access to the transportation system as a whole. This includes stations and other facilities and vehicles. Service levels of the system, such as cost of travel, comfort, travel time, and the spatial distribution of activities, including the location of services and facilities people are looking to access, e.g. the availability to those in low income but low use areas, or to those dependent mainly on public transport. Personal safety was identified as one of the most important factors in women's travel decisions in the DIAMOND data, including their perceptions of safety and security whilst accessing, waiting for, and travelling using public transport. This may relate to the quality of transport stations, including information provision and waiting times, with young women in particular feeling less safe than men, according to the DIAMOND data, when waiting at train stations. The cost and affordability, as I say, of transport also affects fair access to public transport. The barriers faced by people from low-income households have larger repercussions on their ability to participate in wider social life. If you can't afford the cost of travel, then that limits your access to education and employment. And this creates a form of transport disadvantage and raises concerns around concepts such as social and distributive justice. So for use case 1 and for women employed in the transport, for women using public transport, the DIAMOND project defined fairness as there should be a fair and equal opportunity for people with a variety of different characteristics, whether that be relating to age, ability, disability, whatever, to access a safe, secure, effective and efficient transport system that meets their daily needs. Moving on to use case 2 and the use of autonomous vehicles. The use of autonomous vehicles can be seen as a kind of more future form of public transport. In the case of autonomous taxis, building on the existing online platforms such as Uber, etc. While everyday use of AVs in the UK, particularly as stated, will remain relatively low until sometime after, I believe, 2030, there are currently a number of fairness-related issues that apply to AVs in general, but that may also apply to AVs currently being used in the service of taxis. The potential advantages of AVs generally, as well as taxi-specific, include the potential, we are told, to reduce road accidents, produce a safer and more efficient and effective transport system, and an argument that AVs' fuel consumption is decreased due to more efficient driving. However, that does not necessarily take into consideration the initial cost of the ownership and maintenance for EV vehicles, or fare levels even for EV taxis, which may prevent those again on lower income from achieving ownership or using EV taxis. This then affects the equality of opportunity and equity for low-income people. One of the reasons why women in particular feel less accepting of autonomous vehicles is linked to the physical characteristics of the vehicle, as cars have traditionally been designed for male bodies in terms of seating, posture and seatbelt safety. For example, it was noted that until 2011, most American car manufacturers were still using the crash test dummy based on male biology. So therefore, women haven't always felt comfortable in vehicles. So some AV occupants may feel a lack of control and may experience unease about a computer rather than a person controlling the vehicle, with suggestions that a lack of confidence in the technology used in AVs means that currently more than half of the US people who have been asked said that they would rather use their own vehicles. So how do we increase women's participation? How do we make it fair, more fair for women to use autonomous vehicles? So in terms of procedural justice, organisations should work together to develop a set of standards for fairness and non-discrimination in machine learning. These standards should be industry specific, and where existing human rights and ethical standards exist, should be tied to those established frameworks. There is also a need during design and vehicle operations for regular audits and audit trails, accountability via participating in open source data and algorithm sharing where appropriate. To improve social justice, inclusive coding practices and audits for accuracy need to be created and acted upon in terms of equality of outcome. There is a need for transparency and algorithmic decision making and the development of technology that is socially responsible and takes account of variables such as ethnicity and gender. Use case 3, we looked at fairness for women and improving women's use of bike hire facilities. Bicycle or bike sharing are important components of shared micromobility and involve shared public infrastructure and vehicles. There are many reasons cited for the recent increase in cycling, including a renewed focus on and commitment to more sustainable travel modes and a greater general awareness of the benefits, health benefits of cycling and to the environment. And as a method of being transport equality to disadvantaged communities. However, barriers to cycle sharing have been found to be based on sex, income, status, ethnicity, and educational status, mirroring the general findings of the bicycle share literature, which claims that the majority of users currently are white middle-class males. Cost is another barrier to bike hire, with not everyone having access to credit or debit cards to pay, as currently the majority of these services you have to pay electronically as a current requirement. Therefore, fairness issues related to the underrepresentation of different groups, including women, utilising bicycle sharing is important in terms of equality of opportunity. Certain characteristics, age, disability, income, and childcare responsibilities can limit women's cycling activities. And this means that some groups are less likely to have real opportunities to access bike sharing facilities. In relation to equity, notions of both vertical and horizontal equity, as discussed previously, are required to ensure that all women from across the various characteristic-based groups have similar and equal access to suitable bike sharing facilities. This in terms of location, cost, timing, safety, suitability of types of vehicles, bicycles suited to those accompanied by children, etc., which support their ability to take part in economic and social life. Providing this level of access would support improved distributive justice by improving the match between distribution of bicycle sharing services and the need for them. Procedural justice would prioritise disadvantaged groups, reduce inequality of opportunity, and should help to mitigate some of the transport externalities. Use case 4, women employed in the transport sector. There are still many men and women who believe that there are certain roles and careers that are more suited to men than women. This gendered view of roles has a direct daily impact on women in the workplace. In relation to their working conditions, which can also result in a lack of specific policies to support women in the workplace. This is also mirrored in the current EU employment statistics, which claim currently only 22% of women work in the transport sector. In the rail sector, the share of women amounts to 60%, in the human resource department, but only 3% amongst drivers. Job segregation is also highlighted by the current link between the male domination of the transport sector and the working practices operationalised in organisations. For example, long working hours that are not always family friendly, particularly in the case of certain mobile professions that may require prolonged absences from home, and in an inflexible approach to work routines, which does not provide the opportunities to work from home or remotely, or the hours or the shift work, long days, etc. Women in the workplace in general face more discrimination than men, particularly in male-dominated cultures such as the transport sector. Sex discrimination and sexualised harassment in the workplace is also an additional challenge faced by women in the workplace, and is based on specific gendered culture existing in male-dominated workplaces. A lack of policy to combat abuse and a perceived absence of support from employers to women who experience discrimination appears to be a cause for many women leaving their jobs in the industry. A further and important theme to emerge from both the literature and the data collected from the DIAMOND project regarding women employed in the sector related to a lack of separate facilities for women in the workplace. The working environment in transport organisations tends to reflect the dominant male workforce, and as a result, women often have to adjust to a male-centred organisation of work, workplace culture and working conditions. A similar situation exists in relation to health and safety issues in the workplace, which are usually male-centred and is reflected in the lack of female toilets, showers, or the provision of suitable female personal protective equipment and segregated changing rooms. Fairness in employment would in the main relate to equal and fair access to all types and all levels of jobs in the transport sector, together with education and the training that is required to access these specific roles. Once employed, women should be able to access fair and equal working conditions, working hours, access to facilities, toilets, etc., together with fair and equal outcomes such as opportunities for promotion. Therefore, the DIAMOND project submit that fairness in employment for women relates to equal access to all types and levels of jobs in the transport sector, together with education and or training which is required to access the roles in the sector in the first place. Once employed, women should be able to access fair and equal working conditions, together with fair and equal outcomes such as opportunities for promotion, and that maternity leave and part-time working because of caring responsibilities would not impact this. So in conclusion, what can we say? Fairness is inclusive of the following. The DIAMOND definition of fairness is inclusive of the following concepts. Procedural fairness is required for rules, formal rules, and explicit or implicit, which are consistently applied to all individuals. It is based in justice. Within the justice, we have distributive justice and social justice. Equality of outcomes are strict egalitarianism and equality of opportunity. And a final note to say that although the DIAMOND project has been exploring fairness for women in transport use and employment, we found that the majority of our participants constantly reiterated that if you make employment and use fair for women, you make it fair for everyone. So fairness supports everyone's use of transport. Thank you very much.
Hi, how are you? Sorry, I was muted and I couldn't mute myself. Well, thank you very much, Yvonne. I would like unfortunately, fortunately, we are now in time. I would like the organization to let me know how can I reach the panelists so that I can follow up with the timing. Because unfortunately, I could not unmute myself to let Yvonne know that the time was pressing. In any case, thank you, Yvonne, so much for this very exhaustive explanation of the work you have done in DIAMOND. And coming up next is Dr. Lena Levin. Lena is, if I may, is research leader of the area of mobility, social inclusion, and justice at VTI. She has been conducting research on gender and diversity in transport mobility for more than 15 years. She will now present us the work carried out at TInnGO on gender and intersectionality into practice for transport planning. Lena, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So yes, I will present parts of our work in the TInnGO project, and this is about how we work with theories and of gender and intersectionality in practice for transport planning. Here comes, yeah. I think I will have all my, no, back. So the background for this approach is that TInnGO is this 3-year work is focused on gender and diversity mainstreaming in research and practice, and it is based on theories of gender and intersectionality worked out, and we work out methods and tools to increase gender and diversity mainstreaming in different contexts, the local context in Europe. We work in which perhaps have been presented before or shall be presented in this conference in 10 hubs, local hubs in 11 European countries. So I can just give small parts of this and glimpses of what we have done. And this will be focused on the Scandinavian hub. So my content of this presentation is to say something about what is intersectionality and why we use this concept, and can we use all categories at the same time. I will give some examples, and I will also give some conclusions in the end. So what is intersectionality? It is an analytical framework for analyzing and understanding how aspects of a person's identity is combined with many different modes, many different aspects, which can be discriminated or privilege the person in different situations. So, and the term was conceptualized and coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in the 1980s when she studied women in car companies in USA, and she found that they were discriminated against as women and as Black women. So they were not discriminated as women, but as Black women. So the gender and the color of their skin was working together in the discrimination process. You can read more about her work in her papers. But the core here is that we need to consider gender in a combination with other individual aspects, such as age, ethnicity, cognitive or physical ability, or class or economy, or living, perhaps if we live in urban or rural areas, or social situations, if you are dependent or independent, or if we are young or old and can drive a car, and such things. So that is why we use intersectionality. In transport planning and research, it is a useful tool to identify intersecting factors of advantage and disadvantages. So intersectionality can identify the multiple factors that lead to diversities within groups of women and men, and their travel behaviors, choice of transport mode, and the barriers to access transport. It is a way to work with gender and diversity action planning, and we have developed a framework of gender and diversity action planning, which we call GADAP. I will say a little bit about this, but we will also present more about this tomorrow in another session. And this is a framework for mainstreaming gender and diversity, which the TInnGO have introduced. And this method is based on the assumption that it is not enough to simply add a gender component in a given project or activity, but all programs, policies, and budgets must consider their impacts on various groups of women and men from the beginning and to the evaluation. It's not just add some aspects in the middle of a project. This needs to be from planning to the end, and it needs also be followed up in the end of all projects. So following this, the TInnGO project employs gender with an intersectional perspective. And can we use all categories at the same time? We have got this question many times in our work. We have worked with municipalities in planning and practice, and they also often are confused when we talk about the intersectionality, and that's why we use the concept of diversity instead and try to explain that this is a variation we need to look at, and all categories might not be relevant in all cases. So yes, my answer here is yes, we can, but it is better to be more specific. Define a target area and analyze what categories are relevant, and solve one problem first and go on with the next one. Because intersectionality can split into many categories, and if you take a very broad perspective in the planning process, the items might be too small to say something substantial about each of them. So it's a useful concept when you look at a broad population and try to make a state of the art, but then when you go on work with the practical problems, you need to be more specific and perhaps look at two categories or more and each time, but not all of them. I will give some examples. For example, we have investigated specific transport modes, for example, cycling in connection with an inclusive approach. And there we have used ethnicity and gender and caring as aspects approaches to analyze how women from different categories are treated. So we found that 55% of women over the age of 35 in a Swedish low-income area cannot cycle. The corresponding number of men is 5%. So, and 50% of the women who cannot cycle want to cycle more. So, and the women want to cycle to preschool, to the work, to the bus, and or to buy food. And a lot of their errands are caring errands and short trips, which is very good for cycling. And now there is planning for increased cycling in, for example, for those women in, for example, in Copenhagen, Linköping, Stockholm, which my colleagues have studied and are going on to study more even after TInnGO. New projects are going on to promote women's cycling with voluntary organizations, for example, the Red Cross, and the municipalities are also promoting this and want to increase cycling. Another example is to focus on age and gender in a specific area, for example, a city, and analyze how people can reach their everyday activities by public transport. For example, whose travel patterns are and needs are prioritized. Where do the money go? This was done in Boden. It's a municipality in north of Sweden. And the municipality worked with this age and gender and budget perspective, and it resulted in improved local traffic to the horse center to support girls' active life. The background is a new contract on local transport with biofuels that was introduced, and then they started to look more in the investment in local traffic, and they decided to promote school children's leisure trips with a new youth travel card, a more affordable travel card, which costs about €50 a year for young people. And then when they had introduced these ideas, there came a citizen proposal from youth people to improve traffic to the horse center, and the Badbyn, it's a local recreation area that hitherto lacked bus stops, and where this area with the horse center and the recreation area were places where young people and especially girls perform their leisure activities. So there was a gender perspective on this increased bus traffic, and the municipality started to look into their budget, and found by using gender budgeting that they favor typically boys' leisure activities. So 80% was spent on ice hockey or the similar, which was attracting boys, and compared to 20% for typically girls' leisure activities such as riding. So this resulted in a decision to increase the bus service to the new horse center, and in the new procurement, more bus trips were included, and new bus stops were built in connection to the horse center and the recreation area. So this is also another example of how to focus on intersectionality, in this case in young girls, and on economy and on leisure activities for them in a certain area. So some conclusions to this. I mean that similar to other knowledge fields, gender and diversity mainstreaming need to be performed by informed persons, and new knowledge, expertise, and analytical framework is needed. And we also need to identify what categories are relevant in each case, in each local context. Not all categories are equally important in all cases. And transport planning often work too broad and too general with social issues. So context-based problems need target-based actions. So you need to identify what is the problem in the specific context, and you need to have actions which is targeted to that problem. It was also clear that planning for gender and diversity takes time. It needs informed leadership, and there is also a need for more expert knowledge in local context in this. And we work more on this with, for example, courses like that, training for local people. And finally, I will say something about this framework I mentioned we have developed, which we call the GADAP, Gender and Diversity Action Planning. And this is following steps in other impact assessment and gender and action planning, but it takes an intersectional approach. So it is taking defining the vision and overarching goals, and define and measure to reach goals, and set up time-bound targets, and define activities and responsibilities. And and allocate means for implementation and prioritize activities, allocate resources, and of course follow up and revise. So based on methods used in the gender equality work, we TInnGO have developed a GADAP tool for gender equality, and we focus this on a smart transport context, and this is aimed to develop or deepen the understanding on the issue of gender and diversity with an institution, a municipality, or similar. So when this will be presented more for tomorrow on a session at 8:45 or 9:45 is in Central Europe time. So you're very welcome to this, and this is an interactive workshop. So we also will introduce some reflection activities for the audience. So thank you for me for this time, and we will see you tomorrow again. Can I stop sharing my screen, or is
Thank you, Lena.
it's done automatical?
I'm gonna pick up this phrase that you mentioned. Context-based problems require target-based actions. I guess this adds to the complexity of the policy making in general, when you have to cross-level sometimes the policy making, even organizational or public, right? So this connects very nicely with our following speaker, Dr. Augustus Ababio-Donkor. He's a researcher at the Transport Research Institute at Edinburgh Napier University, and he will be sharing the results of the DIAMOND project regarding impact assessment of gender-equitable transport planning policies. And I guess all this complexity makes it quite difficult to understand the impact of these policies. So please, Augustus, the floor is yours.
Good morning once again, everybody. Can you hear me well? Hello, good morning.
Yes, we can hear you, Augustus.
Good. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, you can better place it on top of your desktop, because we can see. Yeah, we're seeing the PowerPoint, the one that has okay, now we see it perfectly.
Okay, thank you. All right. Good morning once again. My name is Dr. Augustus Ababio-Donkor. I'll be presenting this morning on gender-equitable transport planning policies. And we're looking at an impact assessment framework developed on the DIAMOND project. We will look at the presentation in the following order. I will give a brief introduction or background to the framework. I'll try to dwell more on the methodological framework, and then if there is time, we'll look at a bit of the results from the framework. Yvonne has said a lot about the DIAMOND project, discussed most of the 4 use cases. And so if there is time, I will only give one results of one of the use cases. I wouldn't go into all the 4 use cases. We'll look at our introduction. With the DIAMOND project, we introduce a framework for assessing the impact of our findings. The essence of the framework or the method is to provide the framework to answer whether the measures that will be proposed by the DIAMOND project will be efficient, okay, whether they will help contribute to equity in the transport sector. And so we try to introduce equity into the existing cost-benefit analysis framework to account for transport equity in our impact assessment framework. We introduce a 3-dimensional impact assessment framework which incorporates efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. And so we try to measure all the fairness characteristics or the measures that will be proposed from the project, how efficient all the measures will be, how effective the measures will be, and whether the measures that are proposed will lead to equity in terms of ensuring fairness in the transport sector. And as again, we estimate the KPI, that's the key performance indicators, for efficiency, for effectiveness, and for equity, to help guide the decision makers on the selection of fairness measures to implement if they want to make a decision. The essence of the framework, I said, is to determine whether the measures that are proposed by the project, one, are efficient. By efficiency, we mean how productive are the proposed fairness measures? How will it cost? And so we're looking at the cost effectiveness of it. We are looking at it from the angle or the perspective that you wouldn't want to spend so much resources in achieving the same goal. And so if there could be measures that could be implemented at a lower cost to achieve the same aim, then we could recommend those measures instead of just implementing all the measures. Then two, we'll look at how effective are they? Will they actually lead to the desired goal? The goal of DIAMOND is to help ensure fairness and equity in the transport system, to help make sure in the use and those working in the transport sector, we have fairness. We have a lot of women participating in transport. So in terms of employment, you want to see the percentage of women working in transport increase. In terms of those using transport as a service, you want to see most women use the services, and you want to see most women satisfied with the services. And so with the measures that have been proposed, will the measures be effective in ensuring or achieving this desired goal of the DIAMOND project? And then finally, we also assess whether the measures are equitable in leading to the specific goal. Will they help achieve the fairness or the equity we're looking for in the transport sector? So this is how we assess these measures. We also, as part of the framework, assess the sustainability of the resource that we'll find from the DIAMOND project. And so we'll look at the sustainability in two ways over a period of time. Like if the perception or the focus of women changes over time, will the resource still be relevant? And then we'll look at it per culture. And so if we should take the UK, or we should take Spain or Poland or any other country, would the resource be relevant in these countries? And so if we want to compare one country to the other, how relevant are the results or the findings that we have in the project? And so we'll look at the results from that angle. Now we assess the hierarchy of the measures to prioritize which of them is of high importance from the perspective of time and from the perspective of countries. It's useful to use this method because it's helped reduce uncertainty in decision making. Why? It helps the decision maker to eliminate alternatives, okay, and give them more information to see which of the alternatives or measures that are proposed will lead to the objective that the decision maker is looking for. And so looking at the resources you have available and the decisions you have to make, which of the measures would you want to implement, looking at your resource constraint or whatever resource you have available at the time. So we'll look a bit on the methodological framework. From methodological point of view, we collected data and a lot of data for all the 4 use cases using a couple of measures. And so using surveys, dynamic argumentative surveys, using interviews, focus group discussions, user satisfaction survey, we've collected a lot of data on women's needs and barrier in the transport system. And so looking at all the 4 use cases. The data collected was analyzed using both quantitative and qualitative analysis method. And then we arrive at what we term as the fairness characteristics. And so we have the fairness characteristics where we show which are the factors that are important to women in terms of achieving the desired goals. Okay, so which are the barriers and which are some of the needs women require in order to address the fairness issues we have within the transport system. As part of the analysis of the results, also look at the sensitivity or the sustainability of the results over time. And in these two, we combine them into what we refer to as the impact assessment. And then we have a third leg, which is the productive equity analysis, which looks at equity analysis, looking at how equitable, okay, or how would the results lead to equity in the transport sector. And this is done for all the 4 use cases. To take on to the first aspect of it, what we're looking at the fairness measures that were developed. If you take all the 4 use cases, so for instance, this table is looking at the first use case, which is railways or public transport or public modal transport system. We apply several research method or data collection tools that I said we use DAD, which is dynamic argumentative Delphi survey method. We use online surveys, interview, user satisfaction surveys, focus group discussions, and to name the list, to collect data. Now, this data is analyzed from a qualitative and quantitative aspect, okay, using AHP method and then using Bayesian method to arrive. Now, the measures are clarified, and we have the measures. If you should take each of the measure from the first column on the table, we have the FC code, which is the fairness characteristics code. And so we have FC111, which represents the fairness characteristics. 1 is level 1 fairness characteristics, which gives the general theme. And so we're looking at the general themes from the point of accessibility, from security, and from the design perspective. And so we have 3 levels of fairness, level 1 fairness characteristics for use case 1. And then we have the level 2 fairness characteristics, where we look at, okay, within the fairness characteristics, what are the sub-themes we have under accessibility? And so we have service and availability. And then when you come to the second one, which is safety and security, we have harassment, we have overcrowding, and the rest. Then under these sub-ones, we have what we call the level 3 fairness characteristics, which also look at the sub-fairness characteristics or the specifics under the level 2 fairness characteristics. And so we have, with this one, the first one, we have something like working time from the point of interest to the public transport access. So if the working time is longer, what is its impact on women's use of the services? And then on the far right, the last column, we have what we call the fairness measures. So these are measures proposed, okay, to address the challenges we are talking about in level 3 fairness characteristics. And so this is done for all the 4 use cases. Then we'll look at the sensitivity analysis or the sustainability analysis. Now, if you should look at the figure we have here, we are showing the figure for use case 1. And so at the top level, the green, we have what we call the level 1 fairness characteristics. So that is the general themes we have under use case 1. Now we are looking at this sensitivity analysis to determine how robust are the results that we are going to get from our analysis or from our findings or the study. Under them, the ones in purple, Francisco talked about them yesterday, is the level 2 fairness characteristics. And under the level 2, we have the level 3 fairness characteristics. And so with the sensitivity analysis, what we try to find out is, okay, if currently these are the levels, these are the challenges, or these are how women perceive the difficulties or the challenges with the transport system. If we should give ourselves maybe 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years time, if the focus of women should change, okay, for instance, if currently they're looking at safety issues and now their focus or perception or their issues or circumstances has changed, that look, as concern has to be with accessibility of the service. Okay, if the concerns increases, what will be the impact on the results? Will the results that we have currently still be relevant in 5 years time if the focus has moved from safety to accessibility? And so we try to say, okay, if the perception or the effect, people prefer more on issues that have to do with accessibility. If accessibility and increases, okay, so the weight that was given to it increased by 50%, whilst that for design of the infrastructure and safety and security reduces, what will be the effect on the results? And so we try to do this to see whether the results will still be valid, they will still be relevant over time if this changes, or whether they will still be relevant if we should move from one country to another. Then we look at the productive equity analysis. And under productive equity, I say we look at 3 dimensions. We look at equity, we look at efficiency and effectiveness, or what we call the 3 E's approach. Now with effectiveness, we are trying to measure the extent to which the input will generate objective. And so we have measures that we want to implement, but with the implementation of those measures lead to the objective that we're looking for, i.e. increasing the percentage of women using the transport system or being employed in the transport system. And so we try to look at it and see the effectiveness of those factors. Then we'll have efficiency, where we look at how cost effective are the factors that are being proposed. And so you take all the factors and you can look at them and how cost effective each of them are in achieving the specific goal we are looking at. And so we say here we seek to look at the cost effectiveness, and we're looking at, okay, is it possible to achieve the same goal with the minimum use of resources? And so once you have these indicators and to guide the decision maker know which of the measures are cost effective. Okay, and so if you do not have so much resources, you know which of them you can select to implement to make some inroads. Then finally, we'll look at equity. And equity, Yvonne has already explained and screened the diagram here. We're talking about how we allocate resources. I'm looking at allocating resources fairly such that we only allocate resources to measures that will increase the fairness of the system or that will promote women using the system. So we don't just implement or recommend decision makers to select measures that will end up not even achieving the goal of the project or the goal that we are looking for. And so we'll look at equity. Yvonne has discussed this in the form of vertical equity or horizontal equity. So look at it to say, look, we just want to ensure fairness. And so if there are groups that are disadvantaged in the system, we implement measures that will solve the disadvantages, that will make sure the disadvantages are taken out from the system.
Augustus, excuse me, you're over time already, so please wrap up as fast as you can.
Okay. Okay, then we'll look at productive equity analysis. And the productive equity we'll try to look at, so looking at the methods in assessing the KPIs. And so we take each fairness measures, for instance, what we have in the yellow box. For instance, if you take FC 114, these measures have some level of correlation. So if we should implement this measure, what to be its effect on the rest of the other fairness measures that we have? Would it lead to the achievement of the desired goal? And so we're looking at if we should increase or we should implement this particular fairness measure, bearing in mind that it has some level of correlation with the other fairness measures or fairness characteristics that we're talking about. Would it promote or would it increase the level of efficiency that we're looking for? Would it be effective in addressing the concerns that we have? And so we use this method to get the KPIs for the efficiency. Then for effectiveness. Then for efficiency, we take the effectiveness KPI that we have from the previous slide, and then we divide it by the cost of implementing that specific fairness measure. And so that gives us the efficiency KPI. And so we're looking at once you have this, and that tells you whether that particular indicator, you need so much resources to implement it or not. And then we look at the equity indicator where we have the effectiveness indicator for men and for women. And so we take the ratio of the two, and that gives us how that particular fairness measure will lead to equity. We have some results, but because of time, maybe I'll just look at one of them and then we'll just wrap up. So we'll look at the public transport system and look at results. We have two scenarios that we are looking at in terms of the public transport, where we're looking at railways or the system we have today, and we're looking at it into the future if there should be a hyperloop system. Now, the results will focus on the first system. We're looking at the current system that we have. These are the fairness measures I spoke about. So if you should take this particular table, we are looking at the top 10 fairness measures for women. Okay, so this one shows what we have for women. Now we are looking at it in terms of the analysis of the sustainability. What happens if we increase the level 1 fairness characteristics by 50 and then decrease the rest by 50%? So if you increase it, what will be the effects on the hierarchy of the fairness measures? And so the ones in dark or highlighted are the ones that are showing the ones that are maintained from the original or the initial hierarchy. And so for each of them, you could see when we increase the level 1 fairness measure, it affects on the fairness measures that we have. Then we have it over space, where we are trying to compare between Spain and Poland, what the measures should be. And so if you have the initial hierarchy of fairness measures in Poland, what are the measures that are important to them? And in Spain, what are the measures important to them? And at the right, you could see what the differences are in terms of the fairness measures. In terms of equity, efficiency, and effectiveness, we have this table which summarizes everything. So first, we have the first one is effectiveness, where we have the effectiveness of this particular indicator for women and for men. Now, to find out whether this particular measure will be effective, will lead to equity, we find the equity indicator in this particular column here, where we take the ratio of A and B, and that gives how equitable that indicator will be. And so the higher the equity indicator, it means that particular indicator will lead to more fairness. It means to encourage more women in using the service. And then we have the efficiency indicator, where we'll look at divide the effectiveness indicator by the cost of implementing it, which cost description is given in the column just before the column that is highlighted. And then the indicator also tells how cost effective each of these indicators are. I think because of my time, I'll end it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Augustus. Sorry for rushing you into it. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, this Jackie Bridgman, research assistant at the Societal at the University of Northampton. She's presenting their work on ethical issues related to equity in mobility carried out in the TInnGO project.
Right.
Jackie?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you see my screen? Let's see if I can. I'm pressing buttons and nothing's happening. Can you see my screen?
Nope.
No.
I cannot see you too either.
No, I can't seem to share it. I've got a button and nothing's happening.
So maybe I think the organization needs to give you access or request for the camera and the micro and the sharing screen.
Yeah. Oh, hang on. Oh dear. I'm sharing. It says I'm sharing it. It says I am, but I can't see it. So
No. Is someone from the organization that can help us here? Let me see if I can. I don't think I can. Let me see. Are you here as presentator? Of course, we can hear you, but isn't there any pop-up?
yeah, I've got the little panel and I can see the screen icon, but I can't seem to see my screen. I can see it, but
Jackie?
hello.
Hello.
Nothing's happening.
Jackie, we have been.
It's a terrible echo.
I think that's when she's trying to.
Yeah.
Jackie?
Hello.
Hello. We have been sending you requests for activating both your camera and for presenting. Haven't you received them?
I've had the one. I've got the one for presenting, which is one I'm on now.
We are not seeing your presentation, in fact.
No. Do you want to go ahead with the next one, and then we'll try and work out what we're doing rather than hold everybody up, and then I'll go after.
Okay, let's go with Angela then.
Okay, Angela, if you're ready, I hope you are.
Okay. Yes.
Angela
Okay.
Carboni is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Environmental, Land and Infrastructure Engineering in the Politecnico di Torino, and she will share with us an Italian perspective to gender in sustainable urban mobility plans as elaborated in the TInnGO project. Angela, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you see my screen? No? Yes?
Yes?
Okay.
can see.
Perfect. Okay. I try in presentation mode. It's okay? It works?
Yes, it's working.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. And starting from the primary beneficiary of the mobility planning process are citizens, who should be considered for the unique needs while traveling around the city. So the scope of this work is to raise the attention to the uses that are commonly not considered during the mobility planning process. For example, women. But starting from some concept that define the framework of our activity, our our work. So why is important to raise the attention on this aspect? First of all, the mobility is strongly influenced by aspects such as gender and age, mainly due to different daily activity schedule, different safety perception, different accessibility to different transport mode. And second, the design of transport system influence the mobility choice that the citizens make, so it's important to take into account the need of all users. This work is part of TInnGO Project that promotes gender equality and diversity in all areas of transport, so also transport planning, for example. And in particular, Politecnico di Torino is the leader of TInnGO Italian Hub, and one goal of this hub is to assess the degree of inclusiveness and sensitiveness to gender issue of local sustainable urban mobility plans. A sustainable urban mobility plan is a strategic planning tool at the disposal of cities authorities to promote and balance and integrate development of all transport systems to stimulate more sustainable modal choice. Its core goal is to improve accessibility and quality of life. So it's important to take into account all the needs from all different users. Our methodology. Starting from the definition of background, from the review of scientific literature, the collection of this gender disaggregate mobility data and surveys, these activities are part, obviously, of the entire TInnGO project. The core goal that I present you today for this type of activity is the definition of indices that can assess the gender inclusiveness of the plans, in particular the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan. This method is applied in a case study. In particular, the case study is on Italy, on the approved and adopted Sustainable Mobility Plans in Italy. This is the current situation on the number of plans approved, adopted, or in progress. Okay. The indices. In fact, a plan can be classified using different type of indices. Starting from its status, approved or adopted. Adopt means that the plan is available to citizens and stakeholders for a limited period during which observation can be made. And the approved plan has concluded its process and is immediately in force. Then the year in which the plan is published is available. Then the scale, because in Italy the Sustainable Mobility Plans is for cities and metropolitan area. Then maybe the most interesting indices is the presence of different keywords. In order to measure the inclusiveness and the sensitiveness of the plan regarding gender. So the presence of different important keywords as women, gender, female, social inclusion, and other particular keywords that we found in the plan when we analyze it. This type of indices is classified, using 3-point scale. Minus means that the word is not present in the plan. Plus means that the word is present. Double plus means that the word is frequently present in the plan. Same scale is used also to assess the degree of inclusiveness of the images in the plan. And finally, it's important to analyze where the word is present in the plan. So the context. The word is available in general aims or in data collection or in the indicators, measure, and so on. In this slide, I report the first analysis, our first analysis. So the analysis from the metropolitan, the plans of the metropolitan cities in Italy. There are 14 metropolitan cities in Italy, only 6 currently have an adopted or approved plan. In particular, Bari, Bologna, Firenze, Genova, Milano, Torino. This is the main results of our analysis, so the application of the method. In the following slide, I present you some highlights, some interesting highlights from the analysis. For example, in this slide, I report you an example of inclusive images, for example, from Turin and Florence plans. Inclusive images because take into account different gender, different age, different disability, different situations. So it's very inclusive one. Some highlights from the analysis. The gender mobility issue seems overall not so relevant in general. For example, in the plan of Firenze, are report the results of a survey on cycling mobility in all the region, and the information, and is provided specific information on women. More interest is seen from the terms social inclusion, which appear in all the plans apart from Firenze. And this concept states that mobility is fundamental to enable participation in society and provide access to life chance. This would or maybe should refer to female needs too, but these were not explicitly declared, this inclusion. Then the terms as universal accessibility and design are frequently found, especially in Bologna, Firenze, Torino. However, they are commonly referring to mobility of users with disability, so not very linked with gender. The metropolitan cities of Bari and Genova proposed the equity concept. The idea is associated with the accessibility of transport for the most significant, most possible number of people. For example, Genova plan state the stamp promotes equal opportunity in urban mobility to achieve this fundamental objective of equity. So it's very important that the word is equity and not equality, because the difference is very important. As I said in the start of my presentation, the TInnGO Italian hub is located in Turin, and we work a lot with the metropolitan cities of Turin and with the people in charge of developing the plan. We work with a lot of activity, for example, the creation of policy brief and the GADAP that Lena recalled in his presentation, and other activity. And we reach interesting results. In fact, this type of workshop, this type of collaboration increase the attention to the gender issue in drafting the plan of Turin Metropolitan City. It's the only metropolitan city where an open care interest in the topic is found. In fact, one of the goals of the plan is overcoming gender disparities. So we are very happy to reach these results in our TInnGO activities. At the end of our analysis, we start thinking about some examples, some measures, some aspects that that maybe can be added, can be included in sustainable mobility plans. For example, starting from the differences in daily trip chain of women and men. The first one are very complex and are more local level. So it's important to take into account these differences. also in data collection phases, but also in measures. For example, one solution could be to adapt the network, the timetable, the transport services, to these specific mobility needs. Another example, safety is more important. Women are more likely to be victims of violence during their travels, especially on public transport, but not only. For example, mapping the riskiest point, TInnGO produce a tool in this context. So go on the website of the project to find this tool. It's important in order to propose, for example, an increased breathness or promotion of escape routes, or in addition, increasing the safety of cycle routes with appropriate separation from motorized traffic can improve the share of preferred cyclists, is another example. Okay, some in conclusions of our work. The length of indicator explicitly direct to the measure of inclusiveness of female and their mobility is one of the major issues found in our analysis. The starting point should be the recognition and the integration of gender inequality in mobility by identifying typical women mobility patterns. So starting collecting gender disaggregate data, because this is maybe the more important starting point in a plan definition. More attention has been found in developing the plan of twin metropolitan cities, also thanks to the collaboration with TInnGO Italian Hub. So we hope that in the future we can collaborate with other cities in Italy in order to in order to include also gender issue in other plans. Universal design accessibility is often found, but in reality is more in reference to disability only, so not really universal. And finally, Italian mobility planning must be more careful on gender and diversity issues to ensure more inclusive transport. We hope this. And so, thank you so much.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you very much for jumping in. Let's see if Jackie is already ready for her presentation. In the meantime, I would like to remind the audience that you can still send questions through the chat. Hopefully we will have time, at least for one question. And here she is, Jackie Bridgman, Research Assistant.
Hello.
Oh, sorry. Yeah? Yeah? Okay.
Now,
so,
can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it now.
Hooray. Right, that's cool. So you can see my presentation. That's good. Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm really sorry for the technical problems there. So I'll be as quick as I can because I know we're probably over now. But I'm going to talk this morning about how gender smart mobility can be a more intersectional form of mobility justice. I will relate how unequal access to space in the context of smart mobility increases vulnerability to social exclusion related transport poverty, and discuss how incorporating the theory of intersectionality into transport policy can build on advancements made in the use of gender mainstreaming. Finally, I'm going to introduce the TInnGO Intersectional Mobility Indicator tool that you may have seen mentioned yesterday in Andre's presentation. And I'm going to discuss ways in which this could help develop diversity inclusive policies going forward. So I'm going to start really with a little bit about mobility justice and transport poverty. So mobility justice is a paradigm as defined by Scheller that accounts for fairness, equity and inclusion as a frame that considers dynamic patterns of mobility and spatial relations. This means going beyond the idea of static or programmed mobility as infrastructure, spatial design and eco-social sustainability informs and are informed by people's movements and commuting. In sum, no progressive policy can achieve a dynamic equilibrium in urban planning if sectors of society are being excluded or simply tokenized. Participation from all levels of society is needed to influence outcomes and enduring equity in transport planning, as diversity in planning leads to diversity in the making long term. As Scheller tells us, mobility does not always equate freedom, and to think mobility justice is to think immobility as well, and how to overcome the history's movement restraining contingencies over minorities. The terms mobility justice, defined by Scheller, transport justice, Carol Martins, and transport poverty, Karen Lucas, are all terms that serve to understand the disparities in mobility and accessibility for citizens from disadvantaged backgrounds. Transport, as we know, can either be an unavoidable barrier to escaping social exclusion or a bridge which enables social mobility. As illustrated by Jones and Lucas, the micro-individual oppressions of social groups vulnerable to accessibility, such as those without cars, disabled and older groups, interact with those issues on a macro level, such as inadequate transport provision and other local services, and then those at the meso level, stemming from inter and national trends, restructuring of global markets, laws, cultural influences, possibly we could add pandemic in there. We support the view that social exclusion is a constraints-based process which causes individuals or groups to be unable to participate in the normal activities of society in which they're resident, and this has important spatial manifestations. All transport modes other than walking typically incur cost, with faster modes such as cars or trains incurring higher costs than slower forms such as cyclings or buses, but access to faster modes of transport offers access to wider opportunities within a given time. In areas where some of the more socially excluded or those at risk of becoming socially excluded, such as rural settings, the problem becomes even more acute as the number of transport options decline. Even walking here can be out of the question due to distance, time, safety, or the health of an individual. So where are we at with kind of bringing gender into the equations and to the table? So the current landscape is gender mainstreaming. This is embedded at the European policy level for some time now, but it's not very widely been adopted in this format and on an individual country level. Very good examples of where gender mainstreaming has worked have been found in Sweden, in the Nordic regions. Here there's a very long history of incorporating gender mainstreaming, gender equality goals into public policy, and it's an objective in all policies. Similarly, in Austria, gender mainstreaming has been embedded in planning and policy design, and a progressive approach to forcing planning into considering different perspectives meant that city transport networks, urban infrastructures are now no longer solely planned for commuting, but now acknowledge the shorter trips, more frequently made by women, taking into account unpaid caregiving duties such as shopping, school drop-offs, and acknowledging the difference in transport modes for women, which more frequently involve public transport or walking. But is gender mainstreaming enough? Despite this, the adoption of it at the European level, it's not been widely viewed as a panacea of gender equality. Using gender as a primary category for equality is problematic. So some critics have highlighted that it fails to recognise the diversity among men and women. Hankivsky argues that this perpetuates an additive approach where differences are added to the variable of gender, which subsequently can reinforce the privilege of certain groups over others. In Austria, for example, the use of the word gender in the context of urban planning and policy has been viewed as a means to reinforce stereotypes when considering how to characterise the difference between how men and women use space. And it's led to them opting to use the label of the fair shared city. So when we bring gender and smart mobility together, I mean, we know that patterns of men and women differ, and division of household and labour market roles mean that women are more likely than men to be employed in part-time and low-paid roles. Mobility is still heavily influenced by gendered roles in the labour market and the relationship between gender, diversity and power hierarchy. So mobility needs are evolving, changing habits, travel habits and demand for services to increase speed and convenience, and smart mobility is seen as a means of delivering key benefits such as a reduction in pollution, traffic congestion, noise pollution and transfer costs, while at the same time increasing transport safety and improving transfer speed. Doherty et al. Describes smart mobility as a transition to a future where mobility becomes personalised on-demand service with greater consumer choice and new models of ownership. Smart mobility is a paradigm shift away from monomodal transport systems to more flexible and multimodal transport systems, promising high degrees of flexibility and convenience and enabling the achievement of a more sustainable future. Its delivery is connected to the use of appropriate technologies, the consistent and systematic use of ICT, and an understanding and modelling of citizens' needs. The roots of smart mobility lying stem such as computing, engineering, manufacturing and planning, where gender imbalances in take-up of career choices by women persist. And it's worrying to note that a gender gap has already been recognised in the intelligent mobility sector in the UK and in the smart mobility sector in Nordic regions. If unchecked, this may not only limit the opportunities for women's employment and education in this new field, but it also might impact the type and inclusivity of future developments in smart mobility. In TInnGO, we've worked with the 5 indicators of smart mobility shown here, which are used to evaluate how smart is the mobility system in the context of social innovation and how responsive it is to the real needs and mobility patterns of different groups. Applying an intersectional approach then in our research and project development can work as a reply to this demand. So intersectionality, we argue in smart mobility, we argue that an exclusive focus on gender is perhaps too simplistic. Using an intersectional approach means that discrimination on grounds such as gender, age, race cannot be analysed alone, but must be approached as closely interwoven and mutually affecting. Intersectionality aims to advance the understanding of gender and transport through the inclusion of more characteristics to show that transport needs depend on age, race, income and location, for example. Intersectionality can therefore identify the interconnected nature of multiple factors that lead to diversities within groups, i.e. women, their travel behaviours, choice of transport mode and the barriers faced in access to transport. When we came to write this paper, we found that current research of a truly intersectional nature in transportation studies was quite limited. It is emerging, but it's still limited. We also identified in the literature that there are very big gaps relating to race alongside other characteristics in transport. Scheller tells us that patterns of transportation use and access have been central to the making of American patterns of racial segregation. And there is also articulation to segregation in urban mobility, with migration bringing immigrant populations into cities worldwide. Often these groups of migrants who are working in low-paid, unskilled employment live in deprived neighbourhoods that lack access to good public transport links. These inequalities have implications for health, pollution, road safety, and also opportunities for social mobility. So I just want to give a quick example here of a very recent piece of intersectional research into the use of active transport among American low-income youth and youth of colour by Roberts in 2019. This highlights that not only are there benefits of using active transport and sustainable modes of transport for young people, but that equally there are converging social and environmental variables that impact on their mobility practices. Racial profiling of African American pedestrians and a disproportionate risk of pedestrian injury among youth of colour puts them at greater risk just from the colour of their skin. Yet youths from African American families are more likely to walk or cycle compared to those from higher income households or other cultural backgrounds. So how can smart mobility become more socially just? In our paper, we reviewed current frameworks for intersectionality-based policy analysis and discussed the potential for operationalisation into transport policy. Intersectionality-based policy analysis, a lot of words, but it's a relatively new line of inquiry, but has been very well researched in health literature. It offers an approach that's not linear in its application and therefore offers greater flexibility in consideration of the context of place and diversity. Hancock's model draws attention to the relationship between identity characteristics and recommends that this should be considered an open empirical question in intersectionality-informed research and practice, and not assume that any particular category or intersection deserves a priori status, which also might address the issue of how to prioritise which intersections to analyse. Various intersectional policy frameworks developed, such as those by Hankivsky, Devaki, Boleg, and also Hancock, that were intended for health, gender and disability policy, could be developed as an effective tool for smart mobility policymakers if taken in conjunction with reports of transport inequality. When comparing the intersectional framework questions to transport inequality reports, it's clear there are significant similarities. Each relate to power, social justice and equity, together with intersecting characteristics such as, but not limited to, gender, race, ableness and class. So I'd like to introduce Timmy. This is the TInnGO Intersectional Mobility Indicator tool. We've developed this to enable transport policymakers and practitioners to visualize the overlapping nature of individual characteristics and structural aspects of transport poverty and how they relate to smart mobility and mobility patterns. The origins of this tool came from the principle that transport is really the glue that holds many factors of life together. Where you live, work, go to school, shop, socialise, it's all influenced by transport and the access to transport that you have. And we've kind of started to symbolise that as the strands of a fibre optic cable all wound together. So this tool kind of symbolises on the orange outer ring structural and political factors of transport poverty and social exclusion, such as housing, economic activity. And the blue ring of circles are the intersectional characteristics on a more individual level. The green ring, that shows the 5 indicators of smart mobility used in TInnGO to evaluate how smart is the mobility system in the context of social innovation and its responsiveness. And really, I wanted to just say that this is not a fixed tool. It is a discussion kind of tool. It's designed to kind of provoke thoughts, and the characteristics that we've mentioned and covered in this wheel are by no means limited to those that are presented. It may be that you need a slightly more specific focus on certain other characteristics included as well, or you know, it's designed as a start point. And you can download this as an image, or we will be uploading files onto the TInnGO website to enable you to print this off and create you know, a little wheel that you can spin in a similar way to kind of a colour wheel. You know, we do hope that it is of use to prompt discussion, but equally it could be used to measure impact. And really, I think it highlights how all these systems need to be read together to foster equity-based policy solutions. So I'm just going to really conclude by saying that tackling inclusivity and access to spaces for societies that are rich in diversity can't really be achieved using a one-size-fits-all approach to gender difference. Significant advances have been made in the last 20 years in the adoption of gender mainstreaming in transport policy, but the progress of women in the transport sector as transport users and also as employees has not really kept up with this progress. And it would appear that even when gender equality is enshrined in law, it still doesn't appear to be a tangible reality for many women. EU policy has adopted gender mainstreaming as a policy objective with intersectionality as a horizontal principle, but there's no real particular reference to how it can be achieved. At the nexus of a new post-COVID era, there is now an opportunity to build on this progress, which provides a platform to move beyond the binary and draw up the values that underpin an equitable society, acknowledging greater diversity and variance in lived experience. It must be noted that there are limitations in adopting this approach. It's complicated, requires expertise, but the TInnGO TIMI tool that we've kind of are discussing here is a start point, and it enables researchers and policymakers and practitioners to consider these overlapping natures of structural and personal characteristics when developing policies for smart mobility, ensuring that both topics of transport inequality and intersectionality are at the forefront of the design process when developing more inclusive diversity mainstreaming policies. And I will conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. That was a very quick, you know, presentation. You did it very fast-paced. So I want to thank you, everyone. We have a few minutes until having the coffee break. I don't see that we have questions from the audience, but I would like to pose, you know, from these presentations, and actually this event is evidence that the conversation about gender, intersectionality, fairness, and inclusiveness in general is becoming normalized, which is great, right? But then again, we are still seeing very, very few concrete actions being permeated into public and organizational policies. It's like we're still in baby steps. So my question actually for all the panelists today is twofold. Is there a silver bullet for making this breakthrough? And the second one, I hope that we can close the session with some optimism, right? But how far are we from reaching a satisfactory degree of fairness and equality in transport mobility. So who would like to start?
I don't think there could be a silver bullet, as you put it. The whole idea, I think I found during our research and our interviews and speaking to women, particularly with use case 4 employed in the transport sector and those around it, a lot of people in the general public seem to think that we have fairness and equality, you know, the general assumption. So it's not until you try to access or do something that it then becomes obvious that it's not so much. Me being one of them, I was a transport manager 25 years ago and had to use male toilets and had to use male PPE and all of those things. And coming into this project, assuming that things were different, it's 25 years forward and discovering actually it's not. So I think there is a lot of people out there who just assume it's already happening.
I also think that it's a problem when you say that you plan for all and you say that the transport system is neutral. So, and because many of the politicians and planners believe that the transport system is neutral and there is no gender or no diversity issues in this, because it's hard facts, it's concrete, it's technology and like that. But when you start to focus on a certain context or area, and then you lift up the box and you see what's happening, then you recognize that there is also issues, social issues, which need to be addressed in the transport system. And I think it's a little bit about awareness to see the problems, because if you don't see them, you can't solve them. So there is still, I think, lack of awareness and knowledge in this field. But I mean, we should look positive, and I think there is a process going on, because when more and more people see the problems and try to solve them, also other people see them. I mean, it's like a wave going on, I think. So it's coming more. It's really, I hope it will be more general.
I think there is some level of optimism here. We can see some hope in the horizon. Until recently, perhaps we did not have this kind of conversation. Like Angela said, we're looking at equality instead of looking at equity. And so once we are having this discussion about equity, looking at it, look, some people need certain level of resources, not just everything general for everybody. And so once you're having this conversation, policymakers will also be here. And once you are publishing and writing about them, eventually to come to the front burner, and there will be some concrete action from policymakers and politicians on some of these issues.
Yes, maybe starting from analyzing equality, starting to collect gender disaggregate data is the core point, and then apply different measures. But it's important to take into account inequality and then start to work to gender balance. I think it's because it's maybe the only point to open the eyes of the stakeholder, open the eyes of transport planner and so on.
So I will stick to the idea that there is hope, that there is progress, that projects like TInnGO and DIAMOND are actively contributing to this project, and people in the audience who have joined us during this hour and a half are also actively working towards that goal. And with this idea, I think we can wrap up our session today. And I want to thank you and thank the organizers and all at the audience for staying tuned. And I think it's now time for the coffee break. And with this, I would like to thank you and wrap the session.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Patricia.